But today, France is making headlines for something very different. Its national debt. It has reached a record 3.4 trillion euros.
France is broke. Not morally, that collapse happened long ago, but financially. The same nation that once preached economic discipline to the world can no longer balance its own books. With 3.4 trillion euros in debt, riots raging across the streets, and governments toppling like paper castles, France still dares to lecture others about fiscal responsibility. The irony is poetic. The empire that once enslaved half the planet in the name of civilization now finds itself shackled by its own greed. France isn't just falling, it's decaying loudly, publicly, and perhaps deservedly. But how did a global power end up here? And what role does Africa play in this unraveling? Let's break it down. Music, there's a certain tragic elegance to downfall, especially when arrogance refuses to let it happen quietly. France, once the moral custodian of global economics, now stands accused by the very standards it imposed on others. The numbers are not rumors anymore. They're alarms. 3.4 trillion euros in public debt, about 115.6% of GDP, nearly twice the European Union's responsible limit. To grasp the absurdity, imagine an African finance minister proposing a budget with that ratio. Western media would scream fiscal collapse. But because it's Paris, they soften the story, calling it economic turbulence. This isn't just a statistic on a spreadsheet. It's the echo of 5 decades of denial. France hasn't balanced a single budget since 1973. That's 52 years of borrowing to survive, of governing through debt instead of discipline. Every president, whether left, right, or centrist, added another layer of credit over a crumbling foundation. What once looked like sophistication now feels like financial delusion. The illusion finally cracked during the pandemic, when France opened its treasury floodgates, billions spent on relief packages and health subsidies. Understandable at first. But when the crisis ended, the spending didn't. Then came the 2022 Russian gas shock. Terrified of another yellow vest uprising, Paris once again bought peace with subsidies, not reforms. Billions more disappeared into thin air. What started as temporary relief spending has morphed into a full-blown addiction, a political habit of solving every crisis with borrowed euros. But now, the bill has come due. France is paying over 67 billion euros annually just in interest, more than its entire education budget. Debt is no longer a statistic. It's a living parasite feeding on the state. The government is trapped in a vicious cycle, borrowing to repay old loans, then borrowing again to appease angry crowds protesting against austerity. This isn't merely a financial crisis anymore. It's a cultural one. The same nation that once led revolutions now revolts against responsibility itself. The political fallout has been nothing short of explosive. François Bayrou, the outgoing prime minister, attempted to implement an austerity plan, cutting 44 billion euros in spending, only to be drowned out by strikes that engulfed the entire country. Within weeks, he was gone. His replacement, Sébastien Leroux, now leads a government so fragile it can barely pass a budget without igniting chaos. Across Paris, Marseille, and Lyon, the streets simmer with fury, workers crushed by inflation, pensioners suffocated by taxes, and youth hopeless about jobs. France's crisis runs deeper than just poor governance. It's a society unwilling to face the consequences of decades of luxury bought on credit. And behind this unrest lurks a far more uncomfortable truth: the slow decay of Europe's superiority myth. For years, France flaunted its massive debt as proof of sophistication, insisting that advanced economies could manage high leverage with ease. That illusion shattered the moment its credit rating fell and French bonds began trading with the same caution once reserved for struggling African or Mediterranean economies. Now, investors whisper what France used to accuse Africa of being: unstable, unpredictable, and unreliable. The contagion France faces today isn't just economic, it's psychological. A nation that once believed itself immune to collapse is now tasting the very fear it once exported. France's downfall isn't a sudden misfortune. It's the slow death of a myth, The myth that Europe was governed by logic and order while Africa was ruled by chaos and emotion. Yet today, that narrative has flipped. Africa's fiscal policies are increasingly guided by necessity and reform, while France's are driven by panic and denial. So the real question isn't how much France owes, but what its debt reveals. Because beneath the numbers lies something far uglier than financial mismanagement: the moral bankruptcy of an empire that once ruled the world through its wealth. Strip away the charts and statistics, and France's debt crisis becomes a parable of hypocrisy, a preacher now choking on its own sermon. For decades, Paris lectured the developing world, especially Africa, about economic virtue, as if fiscal discipline were its divine gift. It crafted the gospel of austerity, privatization, and poverty management, spreading it across continents through the IMF and World Bank with missionary zeal. But now, faced with its own crisis, France has shredded those same commandments to save itself. To understand this irony, we must look back to the 1980s and 1990s, the era of structural adjustment. When African nations struggled with debt, they were told the fault lay not in colonial plunder or unfair trade systems, but in their supposed overspending. Under IMF policies, many shaped by French economists, they were forced to slash public spending, remove fuel subsidies, privatize assets, and open their markets to foreign corporations. Often French ones. Hospitals collapsed, schools withered, and millions sank into poverty, all in the name of discipline. Fast forward to today, and the roles are grotesquely reversed. France now mirrors the same behavior it once condemned: overspending, fiscal irresponsibility, and dependence on foreign creditors. Yet instead of swallowing the same bitter medicine it once prescribed to Africa, Paris hides behind excuses: war, pandemics, unique European circumstances. When Africa borrowed to build roads and power grids, it was branded reckless. But when France borrows to maintain comfort, it's called stimulus. When France borrows for welfare and subsidies, it's hailed as a strategic stimulus. The dictionary of hypocrisy has never read more clearly. Beneath France's polished arrogance has always lurked a quiet fear: the fear of losing moral authority over its former colonies. As long as Africa appeared poor, Paris could appear principled. As long as African economies were portrayed as unstable, France could pose as the guardian of order. But the illusion is collapsing. The so-called African debt trap is nothing compared to the financial mountain France has built for itself. And unlike Africa, which borrowed to build roads, schools, and power, France borrowed to sustain its own decline. This double standard reveals something far deeper than debt. It exposes the enduring psychology of empire. Colonialism never truly ended. It simply evolved. Its weapons are no longer guns and garrisons, but currencies and contracts. The CFA franc, the foreign aid programs, the French-backed loans, all designed to keep Africa dependent while maintaining France's illusion of leadership. And when African nations resisted, Paris no longer sent soldiers. It sent economists. Control was rebranded as cooperation. Exploitation was renamed partnership. Through this system, France's economic doctrine became a new kind of colonial gospel. We will teach you how to spend by making sure you never spend without us. But now, as France's own finances crumble and its debt spirals out of control, the illusion of superiority is finally eroding. The empire's ledger has come due, and this time, there's no one left to lecture but itself. But this story isn't just about France's decline, it's about Africa's awakening. The empire's fall marks not the end of an era, but the beginning of an opportunity. If the old master is suffocating under the very rules he created, then who will rise to rewrite them? The answer won't come from Paris or Brussels, but from the capitals once dismissed as dependent: Ouagadougou, Niamey, Bamako, and Accra. The question is no longer can Africa lead, but whether the world is ready to admit that it already is. Let's pause for a moment to thank the Traoré Now community, a space where Black voices, stories, and legacies are not just remembered, but amplified. By joining, you're not merely supporting the channel. You're becoming part of a cultural movement reshaping how history is told. Now, let's continue. France's economic decay isn't just a European tragedy, it's a reflection Africa needed to finally stop doubting itself. For decades, the continent was told to imitate Europe's model of governance and finance, only to realize that the so-called master had been improvising all along. African leaders now watch as the emperor trembles inside his own palace. The same French technocrats who once enforced austerity on Dakar and Abidjan are now fighting to stop their own streets from burning. The chants echoing through Paris sound hauntingly familiar: protests against foreign dependency, rage over elite corruption, cries for jobs, and frustration with being told that sacrifice means stability. The irony is staggering. France hasn't just lost control of its finances, it has lost its moral authority. A nation built on double standards was always destined to crumble. For every lecture Paris delivered on fiscal discipline, it ignored its own fundamental rule: accountability. Now that hypocrisy has come full circle, exposed for all the world to see, raw, undeniable, and irreversible,